So earlier this week, Splatoon JP on Twitter announced that we'd be receiving another update coming this week. In fact, the patch should be dropping later today at the time this video is going up. And this morning they released the patch notes. Now, it's surprising to some that we got another patch so early, seeing as 1.2 dropped not too long ago actually. But in one tweet that Splatoon JP mentioned after releasing the patch notes of the previous update, that we should expect another update in early September. And they did that again this time by informing us to expect another update in mid-October. And the point of this update was to primarily focus on specials, and that with the next one primarily focusing on main weapons. And sure enough, a decent amount of changes were made to the specials for version 1.3. So today I'm going to go over the patch notes for Splatoon 2 version 1.3. Now, because it makes up most of the patch, we're going to actually talk about the special weapons first. And first up is Stingray. Now, Stingray has been often considered to be one of the worst specials in the game, as compared to the other specials, it has the lowest amount of impact when it comes to a match. Which I do agree with. It's very underwhelming in comparison to a lot of the other specials, and it does in fact have low impact when compared to other ones. So it seems that they finally decided to do a little bit more when it comes to the Stingray. So a change made to it is after shooting continuously for 1.5 seconds, shock waves are generated that will deal damage. So basically, if you sit still and continuously fire the Stingray, after a while it'll start emitting shock waves from the laser that will damage people that are near it. So if you say you have someone that's trying to dance around your laser, eventually it'll just start shocking them anyway, dealing damage, which I would imagine probably isn't too much. And then it says that as it continues to go on, the size of the beam will gradually increase. So it won't be, the same small size forever. As it goes on, it'll continue to grow in size. And that actually might put value into having special power up on it, so it'll actually last longer. Maybe it changes how long it takes to get to a bigger laser, who knows. But the fact that it has a shockwave at the end of it brings a lot of decent things to it. It really needed a change like that. The weapon, or the special in fact, is just not really that good, and it actually has a pretty low kill time, and low as in it takes forever to kill. So they're doing something about it. Another change is that its default duration is extended by half a second. So they're giving you more duration inside the Stingray, which, depending on the situation you use it in, it could be good or bad. All in all, I think the changes to Stingray are pretty good and were actually needed. Next up is Splashdown, which received a shortened time period when you're in the air. So the time that's spent when you jump, and you're at the peak of the jump, and the ink is forming around your character before you hit the ground, that time has been shortened. The height at which you jump has also been increased. I'm not exactly sure what the point of that was. It kind of seems like the jump height sort of counteracts the fact that it's supposed to be sped up with the previous one, because how far you drop, or the time determined by how far you drop, is equivalent to how high you go up. So they increased the height by 31%, probably to make it a little bit easier to avoid fire, because a lot of weapons, people are instinctively going to shoot you in the splashdown, but to try and kill you before you land. So this might be to give you some space to do it. Then again, this isn't really something I think that should be used as a panic anyway. And then change the minimum explosion damage from 40 to 55. So basically the very outside of the hitbox when it would deal damage originally did 40 damage. Now it does 55. So it does a little bit more than I feel like it should, because there's still plenty of times that I've been killed by the outer hitbox of the splashdown, so I don't quite understand why its damage should have been increased. I think the reason why a change like this was made is because in comparison to other specials, the splashdown hasn't been used as much, so they're trying to give more people a more incentive to play it by giving it a more damage dealing, so it's not always just directly inside the the initial hitbox that'll kill. And then a lot of the weapons that have splashdown have also had their special requirements reduced. So weapons that have, like, say, needed 180 to get splashdown, now it needs like 170 or something. Another one is Inkstorm, which didn't see too much of a change. It had its radius expanded by 13%. So basically the coverage of the Inkstorm has been increased, and that the requirement for it on several weapons have been lowered as well, making it easier for you to acquire the special. This is one of the specials in the game I feel like is relatively decent and is better than a lot of people give it credit for. Granted, you could say that it's because it's not on very, good weapons, things that aren't going to get it very often, and I agree with that. It's definitely, it suffers from the fact that it is on weapons that you won't see very often. But once it gets onto more weapons, I feel like I could see this being, this could pop up a lot more often than it does now. Next up is Baller, which actually got a buff in the last update as well, and they decided to make a few more changes to it. Now it receives less knockback when being fired at, so if you have someone shooting at you, you're gonna either stand still or just get pushed back slightly. They've decreased the knockback done to it. They have increased the default health by 33%. In the previous patch, they buffed some of its health against certain weapons. Now they've just given that buff against everything and then increased it a little bit more. They increased the explosion radius by 17%, and then it has 7% more turfing ability. So one thing it kind of suffers from is that the explosion isn't too big, and that, if you'll get spots where you feel like like the explosion should have killed someone, but it didn't quite get to them, like they're just outside of the hitbox or whatever. So that was one change that I would have liked, or I liked to have seen, and they're finally giving it to that. Now it has a bigger blast radius. Whether or not this is too big of a difference, well, I'll have to see. I'm going to be doing a lot of before and after screenshots to post for people, myself, later today. And then change the minimum explosion damage from 30 to 55. So it's the same sort of deal that the Splashdown got. Very outside hitbox will no longer do 30 damage, but instead will do 55, which gives it more of a chance of actually killing people if they didn't happen to be in the inner hitbox. Now here's one special a lot of people wanted nerfed, and I'm actually not talking about Ink Armor, that's coming up next. That's Inkjet. Now Inkjet had the hitbox of the player increased. Now, the one problem with the Inkjet is that when using it, the player has the normal hitbox of their normal Inkling character. Now the hitbox has been made to not reflect the exact same hitbox of the player, but instead will be bigger, making it easier to be shot down. This is very, very good, as it is really, really difficult to shoot down people in Inkjets if you're a standard shooter. Weapons like blasters and splatlings and brushes still have a decent chance at killing an Inkjet, but your standard shooter has a bit of a trouble time doing it, so making the hitbox bigger was pretty important. And then decreased explosion radius, so now it'll do less for whenever you fire it. It does 17% less damage and 20% less turfing ability. So they kind of backpedaled on a change they gave it from the test fire to the final game, where before it couldn't really turf that well, and they gave it the ability to turf decently. Now they're sort of taking that back as they realize they made it a little too annoying to deal with. And then they decreased the damage done by the exhaust by 75%. And that sounds like a lot, but the exhaust isn't exactly something you would be killing with very often anyway, so I don't really... I don't expect that to come up very often. The exhaust actually takes a relatively decent amount of time to kill in, so it's not like this is going to be a big change at all. There's still some things I'd like to see done with the Inkjet. I personally think that a startup animation needs to be added to it, as that's one thing it doesn't have right now. It is the only special that doesn't have some form of startup, and that's kind of what it needs to be more towards the balanced side of things. Now here's what you're all waiting for. Ink Armor. It has decreased invincibility at the time that the armor is broken. Now, in case you didn't know, when someone's ink armor is broken off, as it shatters, it still provides invincibility frames. This sort of defeats the whole purpose of it being a survive one shot, no matter how powerful, by making it so it survives more than one shot in reality. And that is my only real nitpick with this special. is it went from surviving 1 shot to basically surviving 3 to 4 shots. And it kind of screws over a lot of shooters and makes it almost impossible for them to win an exchange against someone who has ink armor. Now they've decreased the invincibility time, so now it's going to be a bit more likely for something like an NZAP or a splatter shot to win against someone that does have ink armor, rather than having to rely on just trading or outright losing just because of a special. Another change made to it is when the player with ink armor receives more than 100 damage, the excess damage will carry over to the player. So this is one thing that kind of helps towards chargers, as one complaint that chargers had before was that ink armor basically makes their shots worthless. If a charger has a full charge shot and then someone has ink armor, well, their entire charge just went to breaking the armor and that was it. Now, if you have something that deals more than 100 damage, say you have something that does 150 damage and you use that and it breaks their armor, it'll do 50 damage to them as well. So anything that exceeds 100 damage, that extra damage will carry over to the player itself, inflicting that damage, which could possibly result in kills if the player is using the ink armor at too low of HP. And that's all the changes to the specials. Now let's move on to the changes that the sub-weapons got. First up is Sprinkler, which had its middle stage duration increased by 5 seconds. In case you didn't know, sprinklers were changed to where they basically have 3 states. They have the starting state, which spins really fast, the middle state, which spins for at a decent speed, and the lower state, which spins very slowly. They've increased the duration of that middle state to where it's, it's going to spin at a relatively decent speed for a bit longer than it was before. And then the ink consumption on it has been reduced from 80% to 70%. So now it will no longer take more of your tank to throw it. Moving on, we have point sensors, which have had their radius increased by 20%. So if you've ever thrown a point sensor and see that radius, well, now it's going to be 20% bigger, making it easier for it to catch enemies around certain areas, or just in general, it'll catch them out. This is actually one thing I was hoping that Sub Power Up would have done to begin with, but unfortunately it just solely acts as bomb range. Another thing is it reduced the amount of time to take to recover ink. So the recovery lag after throwing this point sensor has been reduced as well. Splash walls received a slight change. The duration between throwing and the wall deploying has been lowered by half a second. Not really too much, but it's better than nothing. And beacons have had their ink consumption lowered from 90% to 75% of the tank. So now it's no longer going to nearly cripple you to place a beacon down. And now onto the one and only weapon that received a nerf in this patch. The only main weapon that has received a nerf is the Tri-Slosher. The Tri-Slosher had its base damage lowered from 62 to 52. Now, this may seem like a very small change because at the end of the day it's still going to two-shot. However, this makes it so the very end of the range and fall-off damage is more likely to three-shot you rather than two-shotting you. As with 62 damage, even with fall-off or at the maximum range of the Tri-Slosher, it could still do enough damage to kill you in 2 shots. Now it has a chance to still kinda two-shot you, but at the very peak of its range and at fall-off damage, it's more likely to have to three-shot you than it would to two-shot you, which is a step in the right direction. They don't want to outright make it a three-shot base, as I feel like that would be a little too unfair, but this is a good trade-off. I would rather take something like this where it's still a two-shot, however it has the potential to be a three-shot if it's at the maximum range or fall-off, rather than just giving the middle finger to the players that use this weapon by making it a base 3-shot. Another change is its range was decreased by 9%. Now, for those that don't know, the Tri-Slosher actually has a range that competes with a decent amount of weapons. And in mentioning the last video about the last update, its kill range was tied with the Dynamo prior to the Dynamo's kill range being increased. Now, that is kinda silly, but now they're finally stepping up and decreasing its range. Do I think the Tri-Slosher is going to be gone because of this? No. The kit on the weapon is still really good, and the weapon itself is still really good, so I wouldn't say that it's going to be gone. I would say that it's going to still exist, however this will make NZAP 85 a bit more prominent in comparison, as the advantages that the Tri-Slosher had, while still there, aren't as defining anymore. In my opinion, I wouldn't say they're very defining anymore, and this would allow NZAP to get a bigger chance in the spotlight for a weapon that has ink armor. Now, there are a few more various changes made that I'm not really going to go over, and if you're curious into those, you can look at the links below in the description, as I will link both the Japanese patch notes, the English ones if they're up by the time that I upload this, and then a fan translation patch notes if you were interested in those as well. So that's it. I want to know, what do you guys think of all these changes? Is there anything you agree with, anything you disagree with? I'd like to hear your thoughts on everything. And I want to thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.